Let's get started here. Today we have Jason Mark, author of Satellites in the High Country, with us, coming off a very nice interview with Utah Access NPR yesterday, and we are going to have a discussion about satellites in the high country. So, Jason, why don't you take it away and tell us about the book?
Well, first of all, thank you so much to you, Jason, and Jamie, and everybody there at Island Press, not just for organizing this, but of course for publishing the book in the first place. It's been great to work with Island Press, and I hope folks who are listening and watching, you continue to track what Island Press is doing, because it's clearly producing and publishing some of the most important environmental titles today. I wrote this book basically to investigate the question, is there anything that's still really, truly wild, especially in what some people are calling the human age, or the Anthropocene. And some folks might have heard of that idea. It's basically the idea that we've left the Holocene, the geologic epoch in which human civilization evolved, and we've now entered a whole new epoch, the age of man. And if, in fact, all of the world is becoming a human artifact, where does that leave space for wildness and then for wilderness? Wilderness, as the place where wildness has the chance to express itself most fully. And so I spent a good part of 2 years going to some of the most rugged, remote, and wild places in America, from the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, the Gila Wilderness of New Mexico, the Gore Range of Colorado, to the Hoh Rainforest of Washington, among many other places, to answer that question.
So, very few Americans are making it to the U.S. or even wild places in the rest of the world. Why should they care about wildness?
I mean, that's a great question. I think it's true that for a lot of Americans today, to talk about the wild or to talk about the wilderness, it's kind of, let's face it, it's kind of esoteric. Most people spend most of their lives in cities and suburbs, landscapes that are totally dominated by human interests and human will. And very few of them, make the effort to really go beyond blacktop. I mean, obviously our national parks are an incredible treasure, famously, America's best idea. And I think the front country of the national parks is hugely important, but, a very small percentage of people actually get beyond the blacktop and just go on their own 2 feet or, via horse or mule farther than that. So why should they care? And that's a really important question. I think, and I write about this in the book, that there's a real psychological benefit to just knowing that someplace is away, that someplace is kind of off the map. Doesn't mean it's unmapped, right? We know that, now in the 21st century, there's no more blank spaces on the map, not with, Amazon drones and Google Earth and GPS, et cetera. But there are still places that are away, that are to some degree beyond the reach of the corporations and the state. And that's a really important thing to have. That really became clear to me when I went to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge with Michael Bruin, the head of the Sierra Club, and DJ Spooky, a New York hip-hop impresario, and other folks. And you think about the now 15, almost 20-year-long running battle to have oil drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And hundreds of thousands of Americans sent letters to members of Congress opposing oil drilling there. And most people knew they would never, ever make it to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. But it still mattered to them. They just wanted to know that there was some place that was away. And so I think even if all you do is maybe go to the edge of wilderness and sort of peek in over the view, it's so important to have those places. And then finally, to answer your question, Jason, I mean, I think, and I write about this also in the book, I think there's a real political virtue to wilderness, or what we call, I guess you could call a civic virtue. Again, knowing that there's some place that, if necessary, you can escape to. And this isn't just, this isn't just theory, this is real American history. If you think about American history, the wilderness has provided, the last resort for the dissident and the religious apostate and the fugitive slave. And so I think if we lose this sense of having someplace that's away, I think it's also bad for democracy and for political liberty.
So in that sense, is there a role for a public-private partnership to secure wilderness areas? Do you see that as a legitimate path to preserving some of this space?
Well, I mean, so one thing that's important to keep in mind, right, is that in this country we have a legal definition of wilderness, which most other countries don't have, and that was codified and established more than 50 years ago via the Wilderness Act of 1964. And the law is very clear what is and is not allowed in wilderness. It's got to be a roadless area. It's a place where man himself is a visitor who does not remain, that is untrammeled, the untrammeled earth. Lawful hunting and fishing, of course, can happen there. Some cattle grazing can happen there. But again, it's a mostly undeveloped landscape. So we're lucky to have that. That's 105 million acres across the United States. But yes, I mean, in terms of public-private partnership, it's important to remember that at least that number, if not more, and it's hard to get a firm figure, is held as essentially undeveloped land by private landowners or by large landholding organizations like the Nature Conservancy or the Trust for Public Land. But I think those relationships between what the federal government has in its public lands portfolio, and again, it's not just wilderness. I mean, there's a lot of places that would be called wild lands in terms of, the Forest Service areas that are roadless or the BLM areas that are roadless. But more partnerships between the federal land agencies and those big private landowners are going to be more important than ever, because as climate change becomes more serious, it's going to dislocate plants and animals and critters from their homes, and they're going to have to migrate. And key to that migration is going to be corridors that connect preserved landscapes. And I think the only way to make those corridors and to make those connections so that wildlife can migrate is going to be really close collaboration, again, between private landowners and the federal public land agencies.
So that's pretty interesting. That this quest for wild is not only beneficial to humans, but also it's completely necessary for critters and wildlife.
No, that's
go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean that's always been one of the main motivations of public lands protection and wilderness protection is it's just biological and ecological necessity. And again, as I write in the book, I think that's more important than ever in this era of climate change. Some, and I think they're really a minority, but some conservation biologists would say, wow, these small isolated pockets are not doing everything that we need them to. And that's true. But just because something is not 100% complete, I mean, you don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. And these refugia are going to be more important than ever in climate change. I think the case for wilderness protection, if anything, is more important in the era of climate change than before, even though we know that the threats are now multidimensional, right? In the 60s, you could have thought, okay, it's enough to draw a circle or a square around a piece of land, and that's going to keep the bulldozers out. Well, with climate change, with persistent organic pollutants, we know that threats will easily hopscotch over that line on the map. But that line on the map is still vitally important, and again, more important than ever.
At one point in the book, you write about no one under 40 seems to backpack anymore. How are we going to change that? How are we going to get the majority of populations around the planet are now living in urban areas away from ideas of wilderness? How are we going to get more people out into wilderness to appreciate it and to want to protect it?
Yeah, I think the challenge here is probably self-evident, right? You don't fight to protect what you don't know or what you don't love, and you don't love what you don't know, right? If people have just never been to wild places, they're not going to have that emotional connection to them. And I know that the big environmental groups in this country, as well as agencies like the National Park Service, are very worried about losing a constituency of wild nature lovers as you know, as the ranks of backcountry enthusiasts gets older and grayer. So how do you sustain that among a new population? You know, I went to the Arctic with a wonderful woman named Rue Mapp, who is co-founder of a group called Outdoor Afro, which is working across the country to increase African American communities' engagements with the outdoors. There's another group called Latino Outdoors, trying to do the same thing among Latino communities. You see, you know, President Obama's recent designation of the San Gabriel Monument right on the edge of Los Angeles, right? The nearby nature, allowing all of those millions of people in Los Angeles a place to get into wild nature just at their own back door. And so those initiatives are going to be crucial. And again, you know, I have to say it is a big challenge. But when I think about the work that groups like Outdoor Afro are doing and Latino Outdoors, the National Park Service or the National Parks Conservation Association, you know, again, taking kids from Los Angeles, bringing them out to Death Valley so they can, for the first time in their life, see the unblemished night sky. All of those initiatives are hugely important. And as I, you know, keep my ear to the ground and track them, I'm cautiously optimistic that that different nonprofit groups and the Park Service are doing the hard work that needs to be done to again create this new generation of wilderness lovers and backcountry enthusiasts.
If any of the viewers out there want to ask Jason a question, go ahead and submit it on the Q&A portion of the Google Hangout here. That'd be great. So what do you see is the future of wilderness? Is there hope for wild places, and why do you think there is hope? Why do you personally think we can solve or create and protect these wild areas when there's been so much bickering and partisanship and gridlock? How is this going to get done?
Yeah, you know, I am really hopeful. First of all, you know, wilderness is mostly about saying in this space, we're going to not let human intentions call the shots. And I think there's firm still political commitment for sustaining the wilderness areas that we have. We have to know that they're gonna change. You know, there's a really interesting article just in today's New York Times about how some of the areas in the desert Southwest in New Mexico that have been burned by fires in the last 10, 15 years, ponderosa pines are not coming back. And those landscapes are going to change. They're going to change faster with climate change. And this is the hard thing to hold on to, right? Keeping our heart connected to landscapes even as they transform into new landscapes that appear unfamiliar to us. That said, I am encouraged. You know, I think about the long-standing bipartisan commitment to public lands preservation. You think about, you know, our newest wilderness area up in Idaho, Boulder White Clouds. That was spearheaded by Mike Simpson, you know, a conservative Republican who probably is not going to see eye to eye with a lot of other environmental champions in Congress. But he knows how important wilderness areas are to his constituency. And again, you think about, you know, I spent some time with Outward Bound and shadowing a group of young men as they were mountaineering in the Gore Range of Colorado. And there's something really important in the fact that both prominent Colorado conservatives as well as prominent Colorado liberals are both major donors to Colorado Outward Bound. You know, in the wilderness, you learn universal values. And so, you know, when I think about those small examples, it does keep me hopeful that we'll continue to recognize that it's important to have some places that we just let evolution unspool as it always has and that we don't call the shots.
There's a question from Catherine. For young people who don't have much experience in wild places but want to start exploring, where do you recommend they start?
That's a great question. I guess my first answer is the nearby nature, right? You don't have to go to some very far remote locale to get out into a landscape that, especially for a young person whose whole life has been in cities or suburbs, it's going to be mind-blowing. The nearby nature could be a state park. It could be a regional preserve. It could be one of our national features. are located next to major metropolitan areas like Point Reyes National Seashore here in Northern California. So I think that's the thing. It's, it's the day hiking. It's the, maybe it's the mountain biking. It's getting away to those local state preserves. And then, yes, perhaps from there going farther. The trick, Catherine, right, is that you usually need somebody to kind of introduce you to it. Going out into the deep wilderness is, let's face it, it's dangerous. And you want to be prepared and you want to be smart. And so that is going to usually take somebody to introduce you to it. But again, that gets us back to the great groups of the great work of groups like Latino Outdoors, or here in the Bay Area, a group called Bay Area Wilderness Training, which equips teachers and other educators with the skills they need and the equipment they need to get their students or their young the young clients that are serving out into natural areas. So. And that's a long answer, Catherine, but I guess the short answer is just finding the local, regional, or state park close to home, going on a day hike, and hopefully that will be the gateway drug.
Speaking of danger, so you've had lots of encounters with the wild. Can you recount any stories that might be in the book or not in the book about some kind of danger you encountered?
I mean, I think the book opens with a little bit of a self-deprecating story in a backcountry foible I had years ago when I was injured in a place called Aravaipa Canyon, Arizona, on a solo trek and had to get my way out of there. And that was a little, that was worrisome for sure, but I'm here in one piece. I think probably in the course of reporting the book, the biggest close encounter, the closest encounter with danger probably was flying in a bush plane through the Brooks Range of Alaska. And you fly through the mountains. You don't fly over the mountains. And so that was hair-raising for sure. But we had only been in the National Wildlife Refuge a couple of hours when we had a very close encounter with a grizzly bear. I might be able to share a photo of that here. And let's see if we can do this. Is this gonna work on this screen share? Yeah, it's gonna work actually. Can folks see that?
Yeah, we can see it.
So yeah, I mean, you can see that grizzly bear is getting awfully close to us right there. And yeah, that's a critter that you don't want to tangle with. That's flying through the Brooks Range, a little scary. So when you go into the deep wilderness, there's a chance you're going to see a critter you're not going to want to tussle with, and obviously you just need to be prepared for that. I think that's an important function of wilderness. There's a line that I share with readers in the book from the poet Gary Snyder that when you return big predators and big carnivores like wolves and bears and mountain lions to the landscape, that's ecology on the level where it counts. Listen, almost nobody's gotten attacked by a wolf in North America in decades. Bear attacks do happen. We saw 2 hikers killed by bears in North America this summer. Mountain lion attacks are rare. So it's a small chance, but it's important to kind of know that we're not at the top of the food chain. And I think that engagement with big predators is one of the huge benefits of wild places. It just kind of puts us in our place and reminds us that the whole world is not here just for us.
Going back to that image that you so quickly skimmed over, the cooler in the Alaska, what was that? Is that were you running out of beer and you thought that was kind of wild or something?
We can get to that. There we go. See that?
Oh, looks like it was eaten.
So this is the Arctic National Wild. That's a horrible selfie. Herds of caribou on the wildlife, on the plain there. We're in this very remote place with caribou, and there's nothing around. This is called Icy Reef, and to your left there, you're looking at the Arctic Ocean. As you can see, this is basically the ends of the Earth. And I look down the beach, and what do I see but this blue square? And myself, one of my companions, walk down the beach, and what do we find there but a washed up plastic cooler? the polar roller. Looks, as you said, Jason, like it got attacked by a maniac with an ice pick. Though I think more likely it was a polar bear that used it as a chew toy. And it's discouraging in some ways, right? You get to the ends of the earth and you still have to do a beach cleanup. But I think why that was an important encounter for me, because it reminds us that, yes, the human fingerprint is everywhere, right? Even the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is not exactly pristine. And yet it's certainly wild, right? Just look at that bear, look at all that caribou. And so that cooler actually was this amazing, really amazing gift for a writer in terms of metaphor. But it's an example of how, if we know that we're going to accidentally mar Earth with our accidents, the very least we can do is keep it free from our intentions. If we know that the polar roller is going to accidentally end up on the shores of the Arctic Ocean, we should say, well, then we're not going to deliberately transform this landscape through oil drilling or some other kind of reckless development.
Polar Roller sounds like a good name for some kind of punk band from Anwar.
Yeah, or a Norwegian metal band.
Our national parks and wilderness areas are pretty heavily managed to control visitors, control wildlife and wildfires. Can they still be considered wild?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the tricky things about, and for the book's got, being an Island Press book has got some science in it, and I keep it very readable, but I do go into some of the current debates in the field of conservation biology. And if you talk to eminent conservation biologists like Stuart Pym at Duke, or Reed Noss, longtime editor of the journal Conservation Biology, they acknowledge, as much as they love and care for wilderness, that many of our wilderness areas are too small to necessarily let natural processes completely unfold without any direction, wildfire being the most obvious one. And also I saw this in the Gila Wilderness, where as big as the Gila Wilderness is, the Mexican gray wolves that have been introduced there, they go beyond the wilderness boundaries, right? So a wilderness boundary can't keep a fire out or a fire in. It can't keep a wolf out or a wolf in. And sometimes that does lead to some heavy-handed federal management. More personally than I would like to see. Again, I think we need to make a real commitment to having the most hands-off attitude as possible, because it at least allows wilderness to still serve as one end of like the control experiment baseline. If over here is Manhattan and over here is wilderness, sure, even the wilderness is not untouched, but at least there we're not deciding which species are going to flourish and which aren't. That may involve, in some cases, unfortunate diebacks. That means the white bark pine, for example, is not going to thrive as much, but we're, again, making the commitment to let evolution unspool, knowing that what happens over here on the control end of that domestication spectrum is really important. So it's, yes, I mean, in some ways our wilderness areas are not serving their full function, mostly because they're too small and they need to be expanded and or connected.
So it looks like we got a couple more questions. Let's start at the top from Rachel. Do you ever hesitate to encourage more people to explore the wilderness, knowing that the human footprint takes away from the wilderness of these areas, like the cooler?
Yeah, Rachel, that's a great question. And that came up yesterday, as Jason was saying. I was really thrilled to do a show on Utah Public Radio, and a woman called in from Moab. And of course, Moab is, the ghost of Edward Abbey's backyard. And she was saying, a lot of folks in Moab will not divulge their favorite place for canyoneering or their favorite place for climbing or trekking because they don't want it to be swamped people. And of course, in the 70s and the 80s, there was a real concern about loving the wilderness to death or loving our national parks to death. So yes, it's a serious issue. You kind of want to make sure you don't want to give away your secrets. That said, I think in many places, the land management agencies do a decent job of controlling access. Again, I think about Aravaipa Canyon, Arizona, which I talk about in the book. being a native of Arizona, a native of Phoenix, Arizona, it's a place where I've been to many, many times. And I would hate to see it crowded, overly crowded with folks from Phoenix or Tucson. But at the same time, I'm really glad that the Bureau of Land Management only allows 50 people a day into the canyon. And that's hikers or backpackers. And frankly, I've never even seen more than 3. So, maybe that 50 number, could even be higher and it wouldn't bust out the ceiling. But I think the short answer to your question is really having to either trust in or put pressure on the big federal agencies, Park Service, the BLM, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm missing one, I think Forest Service, to control access. Again, in some places that's not necessary. I was backpacking in a place called the Yola-Boli Middle Eel Wilderness in north central California last fall. And I don't think more than a dozen people went in there throughout the course of the summer and fall of 2014, just because it's hard to get to. So if anything, I'd like to see more people engaging in backcountry recreation and hoping that they take with them the leave no trace ethic and that they leave the place just as they found it, or perhaps in even better shape, by packing out any trash they might find. I hope that answers your question, Rachel.
So kind of to build on that, what role can your book help people? What role can the book help people understand, or what do you want them to take away after reading Satellites in the High Country?
Yeah, that's the key question, right? Because I'm committed not just to writing for the sake of writing or beautiful words for the sake of beautiful words, though I'd like to think that there's a good amount of poetry in the book. But this really is a book to encourage and inspire activism and advocacy on behalf of preserving wild places. I like to think that what this book does is it restates and it updates some of the classic arguments for wilderness preservation that we've had in this country for a long time. It's trying to either introduce to people or to people who are already familiar with it, reignite and re-inspire in them. Kind of going back to the John Muir legacy, the Aldo Leopold legacy, the Edward Abbey legacy, taking those really what are for me bedrock ideals and bedrock values and sharing those with a new and younger audience. Because as I say in the book, and Jason asked about this earlier, I mean, for millennials, I think it's fair to say that wilderness sounds like a bunch of old dead white guys tromping through landscapes that no longer exist. And again, so then how do we make it current? How do we make these ideals current? And that's what I try to do in the book. I've joked with folks that this is probably the first nature book ever written that includes Radiohead lyrics. And that's very deliberate, right? To try to thread together the pop culture of the 21st century with these ancient landscapes and think about how they can connect. So that's what I'm hoping people take from this book, is a real clear sense that wilderness preservation is not a nostalgic endeavor. We are protecting these lands for the future. Someone protected them for us, right? National Park Service was created 100 years ago to preserve America's landscape for future generations. Well, here we are. We are those future generations. Someone protected those lands for us today in 2015. And I'm hoping this book will inspire people to remember that wilderness preservation is a forward-looking endeavor. It's a hopeful endeavor. And that, again, we're preserving lands today for the people in 2115.
Not to give away any spoilers or anything, but what album from Radiohead?
I think I'm pretty sure it's Kid A.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think it's Kid A.
So we've got a couple more questions here. Let's take this one from Richard. Roads dissect important habitats in wilderness across the continent. How important will construction of wildlife overpass underpasses be in reconnecting these lands and supporting genetic resilience of adjoining wildlands, especially given climate change?
That's a great question. So yeah, as Richard points out, in a lot of places, key wildlife corridors are basically just cut in half by either large state roads or the interstate highway system. And we've begun to see wildlife agencies getting serious about connectivity meaning connecting wild lands through either overpasses, going over a freeway or an interstate, or underpasses. Some of the best examples of these are up in Montana, around the, I know the Flathead Reservation's done a lot of important work around this. I know in Canada, the Canadian Park Service around Banff has done a lot of work. And now, just last week, we saw transportation agencies actually in Los Angeles thinking about overpasses and underpasses for Southern California's mostly population of mountain lions, which are suffering from, really horrible isolation and therefore then genetic inbreeding and kind of a genetic bottleneck. And so basically, yes, we need to build overpasses over some of the Los Angeles area's big highways to allow mountain lions, and then of course other critters. That's also going to allow mule deer to move around, and not only mule deer but coyotes and of course all sorts of critters. And I think this is just it's essential, right? Because a human and a bear can share a backcountry path, no problem. And any of you guys who are listening or watching know that, right? If you've been out there in the backcountry, you walk down a path and you're going to see coyote scat and bear scat. Well, a bear that tries to share space on a freeway is going to end up as roadkill. And so I'm cautiously up. And I think we've also seen efforts also in Arizona to create some overpasses and underpasses for migration, wildlife migration down there. So this is going to be increasingly important to make sure that even as we're doing land sparing, and land sparing means setting aside some landscapes, we need to be doing land sharing in those places that are mostly human developed, finding some ways that they can also be thoroughfares for wildlife. Thank you for that question. It's really important.
I see another pretty good one here. Do you think nature can exist within cities? Is there value in trying to cultivate something wild in urban environments, or is that a compromise of the concept of wilderness and wildness?
That's a great question, and I get into that in chapter 1. I should tell folks, as an environmental writer and as an environmental advocate, I cut my teeth, really in part via the urban farming movement. And 10 years ago, I co-founded the largest urban farm in San Francisco. And I did that in part because I knew that you can't get everybody to go to the mountains. And so if you can't bring the people to the land, maybe you try to bring the land to the people. And urban farming, urban gardening, I think is a really important part of that. So I'm a big believer in, again, what I would call the nearby nature, in trying to find ways to thread wildness into our cities. Just this morning, actually, I was on 7 a.m. and I was on a walk with my baby daughter. And what do we spot but 2 raccoons, 2 urban critters in Oakland, scooting down into a storm drain. We have Canada geese that fly over our house every day, and they split their time between a local ball field and a local cemetery. Now, they're habituated to people, certainly, but they're untamed when they're undomesticated. Those Canada geese are moving at their own schedule, and I'm sure the groundskeepers at that high school and that cemetery don't like them there much. So I think those little fingers of wildness into our urban or suburban landscapes, they are hugely important. There's no question about that, and it allows people to be more mindful of natural systems, right? To begin to watch, say, the migrations of the birds or the changing of the seasons, etc. That said, I don't think you can make any real comparison between a raccoon in Oakland going into a storm drain and a lynx or a wolverine prowling the deep corners of the Northern Rockies. I think what that does, that just ends up diluting and compromising, as you said, both the unique power of the nearby nature and the unique power of the distant, remote wilderness. And so I just, I guess my hope for, environmental advocates, and my hope in this book is to encourage us, to kind of speak broadly as an environmental movement. Can we walk and chew gum? And I think we can. can we think about the importance of preserving wild areas in our cities? And by that I mean not like your typical urban park with, you know, lawns and volleyball courts, as important as that is, but I mean like, you know, the urban parks that are mostly natural areas. For example, you know, the large park, I'm forgetting its name, that's in the hills of Portland, which I think is one of the largest urban parks in America, or the Phoenix Mountain Preserve, you know, thousands of acres of essentially intact Sonoran desert is an island in the middle of the city, right? So it's not a cultivated park. It's basically a nature preserve in the city. Those places are hugely important, and they are no substitute for the deep remote wilderness, just as the deep remote wilderness is no substitute for the nearby nature. I think they complement each other.
Yeah, it would be sad if people thought wilderness would be something like the celebrity rat in New York City these days, the pizza rat. I don't know if you've seen tweets about it. Yeah, yeah, you can. I'll let you experience that yourself.
So encouraging. Because this is such an important issue. It's so encouraging to think about the ways that wildness has crept back into our cities. I was talking about the mountain lions in Los Angeles. I mean, folks should Google it right now, or when you're done with this chat. But the photo of the Hollywood lion, right? This mountain lion that is living in Griffith Park. There's a mountain lion living in Griffith Park. There was, for the first time in more than 100 years, a mountain lion sighting in San Francisco this year. Of course, people in more remote areas like Anchorage, Alaska. In Anchorage, Alaska, you just know that you are going to be living with bears as your neighbor, and you accommodate yourself to that coexistence. Obviously, sometimes it goes bad for either bear or person. Unfortunately, you know, it's usually bear. But there is a way to bring nature a little bit, to bring wild nature a little bit closer to us. And a good example, I think, would be Europe, where populations of large carnivores for some species exceed populations here in North America, despite the fact that population density is so much greater in Europe than here, which really reveals that the problem is not the animals, the problem is us. The problem is us being able to wrap our heads around coexistence, but it's clearly possible.
So can you tell me about lynx and your experience in the Cascade Mountains, how you met and what you learned?
Sure. So the second to last chapter of the book is about my little forays, and I guess what you could call the subculture of human rewilding. By this I mean the kind of deep paleo scene or deep paleo subculture. 3 years ago, my partner and I were backpacking on the eastern slope of the Cascades when at dusk at an alpine lake, we ran across a stranger clad all in deerskins. The next day, ran into she and her companions, 2 other people clad all in deerskins, and also bearskins. And I later found out through some internet Googling that who I had stumbled upon was a woman named Lynx Vilden, who was one of the world's foremost trainers in the arts and crafts of primitive skills, right? So the arts and crafts of the Paleolithic. And she does this amazing thing every year called the Stone Age Living Project, in which she and a group of people go into the wilderness, usually in eastern Washington or in Idaho, and see how long they can survive with just Stone Age technologies. And it was and then I went in the fall of about actually a year ago exactly, I was there. A year ago exactly, I was spending my time trying to make a fire with 2 sticks, and spent a time at Lynx's Living Wild School, doing her Primitive Skills 101 training, and kind of investigating what do we lose as humans, what do we lose as a human cult, what do we lose as individuals, and what do we lose as a human culture when we begin, when we're so far from the primal. And it was a fascinating experience. I learned a lot from Lynx and her crew.
Let's take another question. Today, Fish and Wildlife Service made the controversial decision to not list the sage grouse as endangered. Given climate change, will the Endangered Species Act continue to be useful, or should we be more hands-off and give up on some species?
Yeah, so I want to be very clear because there's at least been one review of the book that came out, and it was in general a very appreciative review, and I was happy to see it in the High Country News, but it focused on, or at least the writer of that review seemed to think that my argument was that we should always and in all occasions give up on trying to, say, preserve species. And I want to be very clear, that is not my argument. I think, for example, you talk about the sage grouse announcement today. That's a mix. If you think about sage grouse habitat stretching from, Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, etc., that's a matrix of different lands, right? Private lands, some public lands, probably in multiple agencies, and a mix of different, classifications of preservation. I think in that case, no, we should be doing everything we can to preserve the sage grouse as an important species of its ecosystems, and really, a keystone species in many ways. What I'm saying is that perhaps in designated wilderness areas, we shouldn't go to incredible lengths to preserve sage grouse. That in that area, that might be a control. That still leaves a lot of other land in which to work to preserve the sage grouse. Hundreds of thousands of acres, if not millions of acres of BLM land we're talking about, Forest Service lands, again, working with other private landholders to preserve the sage grouse. So no, let's be clear, we are, as Elizabeth Colbert writes, we are in the midst of a sixth mass extinction. We are in the midst of a real biodiversity crisis. We do need to do everything we can to preserve species. But I think in some places, especially wilderness areas, we should let evolution unspool. And that's part of, actually, I think, smart science around conservation biology. Again, having a control and having an experiment. My gut instinct, and I've not followed the sage grouse thing as close as I probably should have, but I think, listing would have been warranted, and I think listing would have also given, obviously put new restrictions on oil and gas exploration through the sage grouse range, which is obviously hugely important if you think about the way that oil and gas exploration or other mining just shreds wildlife habitat. So I think we need to see more listings, and I think the ESA, I think the Endangered Species Act is going to continue to be a vital tool in conservationist toolbox.
We've got another question from the crowd here. In terms of wilderness and people, there are certainly some equity issues with people's access to nature and the outdoors. Take Oakland, for example. Can you comment on how we might address equity challenges in our advocacy for wilderness? You kind of touched on this earlier with the different groups that help, city urban dwellers get out into wilderness. Is there anything else you could comment on this?
But I underscore that this is among the biggest challenges, I think, for the conservation community. Again, not just a graying ranks of backcountry enthusiasts and wilderness lovers, but also one that is disproportionately affluent and elite. And that is partially because it does, let's be clear, it takes money to gear yourself up. Once you get the tent and the sleeping bag and all of this stuff that mostly you do have to buy, and there are some programs now, some companies that are doing gear sharing. There's one here in the Bay Area called, I think it's called Alight, but it's kind of like where you can rent tents and sleeping bags and stuff, so you don't have to buy all this stuff the first time. So, it does cost money, and this is why we need, and again, I'm glad to see that we do have groups like Outdoor Afro, like Latino Outdoors, doing everything like Bay Area Wilderness Training, doing everything they can to get folks and spread the access. But we clearly need to do more. And I think mostly that's going to rest on the nonprofit community, on the education community. And I would say here that the work, of Richard Louv and his group, Nature Outdoors, trying to address nature deficit disorder is really important. And again, I'm hopeful when I see all the work that's happening to make sure that those equity challenges and equity barriers are knocked down.
And I think this is a good segue into, I think, the viewers of this chat right now, they all submitted and they entered into a contest where the prize was going out into the wild with another author, Christina Eisenberg, to view and see what she does out in the wild and look at carnivores. So we are now going to announce with you some similar kind of event that we'll be doing. We'll probably have a more formal announcement later in the fall, early winter, with a trip to the Grand Canyon. And I think that will be an opportunity for some people to at least, enter and hopefully be a winner.
Yeah, just to kind of share that what we're scheming on, myself and the folks at Island Press, is a little backcountry expedition, as well as a little bit of kind of journalistic fact finding to the Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon is obviously, an incredible natural treasure. It's one of the first monuments created by President Teddy Roosevelt, and is hugely popular. Millions of visitors. I think something like 3 million visitors a year, some huge number like that. I'm probably even underestimating that. And so it's a great example of sort of, natural, a natural landscape that has also a lot of pressures. Is, I think it was Rachel or someone asked, of just being loved to death. A couple of plans for mega developments on the south and the east rim of the canyon, as well as constant swirling talk about either uranium mining and or natural gas drilling and fracking in the greater Grand Canyon ecosystem. So I think it'll be a really fun chance to both dive into some serious issues around land conservation and have a great time hiking the canyon and going to Havasupai Falls.
So to kind of wrap this up, can you give us any recommendations on what just regular people can do to protect the wilderness? Something maybe other than clicking a like or retweeting or something seemingly innocuous like that. Is there something extra?
I would say, and it sounds like we've got some folks on this conversation who are already, I'm sure, veteran backcountry enthusiasts, whether you're a backcountry hunter or an angler or a backpacker or a bird watcher. I would say take people with you. I think evangelism starts at home, and I'm hoping that everybody here in some fashion can be an evangelist for wild nature. Go out there and share with other people your passion. And I think please buy the book. The book will hopefully share some inspiration and ideas, but there's no substitute for actually getting out onto the landscape. And I try as much as possible in my own small way to introduce others to my shared passion, whether that's just a day hike or some amateur bird watching, or perhaps in some cases actually more of a deep backcountry wilderness experience. Take the newbies with you. Take the first timers with you. Whoever shows any a glint of interest, and I think they'll be turned on, and I think it will be a gateway drug for them, and they will then go out and hopefully continue to spread the good word about how important it is that we continue to preserve, protect, and restore wild areas.
Wow, Jason, I don't think I could have asked you to wrap that up any more perfectly than you just did.
Thanks, Jason.
Well, everyone watching, this has been great. Jason, I want to thank you for doing this, and we hope that your book and the messages inside of it will resonate and it will be a great success. And remember, people watching, you can totally go to islandpress.org and get the book, buy a couple copies for some friends, and we'll see you around. Thanks again, Jason.
Thank you, Jason, and thanks to everybody who joined in. Thank you for your really fantastic questions. Hope to see you maybe out in the wilderness someday soon.
All right, cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.